Throughout history there have been many brutal executions which were terrifying, but still crowds would flock to see these. From condemned people being thrown to lions and animals in ancient Rome, to Henry VIII boiling alive a man who was even accused of poisoning, there have been some sadistic methods of execution used. Henry VIII, the Tudor king, would even execute 2 of his own wives, and he continued to change the laws of his country to ensure that more death sentences could be given out, and he hanged, drawn and quartered many people. This is considered one of the most horrifying death sentences in history, as it had a number of steps, and the victim could often be alive right until the very end. But there was an execution that took place in Scotland, which could be considered one of the most horrific executions in the whole of history. The execution of Walter Stewart, the Earl of Atholl, was one which would come straight from a horror film, and it was so brutal it's hard to even believe that it took place. Join us today as we look at the most horrific execution in Scottish history, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Walter Stewart, the Earl of Atholl, Strathern and Caithness, was a Scottish nobleman who was also the son of Robert II, the King of Scotland. He was the younger brother of Robert III, the successor, and he was the uncle to the future King James I. He was a prince in a sense, and in his life he married Margaret Berkeley, the Lady of Brechin, and he had 2 sons. He was in 1404 created the Earl of Atholl. However, during the reign of his nephew James I, the king was captured and was taken to England, being held in captivity. He was held in the Tower of London and also Windsor Castle, but Walter tried and campaigned to have James I released and returned to Scotland. He managed to accomplish this in 1424, and he was then a close advisor and member of the royal court. He was part of the jury that tried his half-nephew, and then was responsible for the execution of his nephew and 2 of his sons. But Walter Stewart then became the great Justiciar of Scotland and was named the Earl of Strathern. It's not known for certain how loyal Walter was to King James I. Some historians claim that Walter's plan to rescue James I was actually an attempt to cause a civil war between the 2 branches of the House of Stewart, the Scottish ruling family. He believed these 2 sides of the family would destroy each other, and then with this he wanted to claim the throne for himself, based upon reviving a claim that his half-brother Robert III had been on the throne. However, at some point Walter Stewart turned against the king, and it's believed that the death of his son may have led to this. Stewart became insensibly angry against the king, and then he joined his grandson Robert Stewart and Sir Robert Graham in a plot against James I. In the evening of the 20th of February 1437, James I and his queen were in their rooms in the Blackfriars monastery. They were separated from their servants, and Walter's grandson and heir Robert Stewart, the king's chamberlain, allowed the co-conspirators, around 30 people led by Robert Graham, into the building. James I, the king, knew the presence of the men, but the king then tried to hide in a sewer tunnel, but the exit was blocked off, and with this James I was trapped and was then murdered in cold blood. Other accounts say that the king hid under the floorboards, and that he was then lifted out of these by the assassins, and that Sir Robert Graham was the man who murdered the king, stabbing him with a dagger or a sword. In the wake of the king's death, Walter Stewart found little support for his cause, and after the murder, the conspirators were quickly rounded up. They were not subjected to a trial, and Walter Stewart was also arrested. He was sentenced to death by an act of attainder, meaning no trial was needed, and that he was to be killed for his involvement in the regicide of the king. However, the execution of Walter Stewart, the Earl of Atholl, has to be one of the most horrific and brutal, as it took place over 3 long days, and his execution was a long and slow drawn-out process. In Edinburgh he was brought to be killed, and was subjected to horrific torture even for the 15th century. Walter on the first day was placed in a cart with a crane on it, and he was then hoisted up and dropped, and his joints were stretched when he violently dropped. He was then placed in the pillory, and on his head was placed a crown of burning iron, which had the inscription, "King of all traitors," mocking him almost like a crown of thorns. He was then on the second day tied to a hurdle, and he was then dragged through the high street of Edinburgh in front of a crowd. Some sources say he was also blinded and tortured with red-hot iron pincers on the second day. But on the third day he was then cut open and disemboweled whilst he was still alive, and his entrails were taken out. These were then burned in front of him, and his heart was cut out and was then burned. After this his corpse was then beheaded and was quartered, and the remains of him were then displayed around Scotland, telling people not to dare to become involved in acts of regicide. One account of the execution states, "And his death declared that there is nothing more popular than justice, for they who were wont to detract him from whilst he was alive, now he is dead, had the most flagrant desires after him, insomuch that the nobles, as soon as they heard he was murdered, came into their own accord for their respective counties, and before a trial was appointed they voluntarily set off in all parts to apprehend the murderers and bring them to justice. Very many of them were taken. The principal of them was put to new and exquisite kinds of death. The rest were hanged. The chief head in perpetrating the wickedness was reckoned to be Walter, Earl of Atholl, Robert his nephew by his son, and their kinsman, Robert Graham. The punishment of Walter, because he was the chief author and instigator of the whole plot, was divided into 3 days' suffering. In the first he was put onto a cart wherein a stalk-like swipe or crane or engine was erected, and by the ropes let through pulleys was hoisted up on high, and then the ropes being suddenly loosened, he was let down again, almost to the ground, with grievous pains by reason of stretching of the joints of the body. Then he was set on a pillory, that all might see him, and a red-hot iron crown set on his head with this inscription, that he should be called the king of all traitors. They say the cause of this punishment was that Walter had been sometimes told by some female witches, as Atholl was always noted to have such, that he should be crowned king in an almighty concourse of people. For by this means that the prophecy was either fulfilled or eluded, as indeed such kinds of prediction do commonly meet with no other events. The day after he was bound upon a hurdle and drawn at a horse's tail through the greatest street in Edinburgh. The third day he was laid upon a plank in a conspicuous place, and his bowels were cut out whilst he was still alive, cast into the fire and burned before his face. Afterwards his heart was pulled out and cast into the same fire. Then his head was cut off and exposed to the view of all, and set upon a pole in the highest place of the city. His body was divided into 4 quarters, and sent to be hanged in the most noted places of the best cities of the kingdom. After him his nephew was brought forward to suffer, and because of his age they would not put him in so much pain, and besides he was not the author, but only an accomplice in another man's wicked design, as having obeyed his grandfather therein, so that he was only hanged and quartered. Walter Stewart today is a forgotten figure in history, but he was a man of around 67 when he died, and he was a schemer who turned on the King of Scotland James I, who was also his nephew. It's believed that he had motivation to become the king himself, and to seize power, but ultimately he was executed in a terrifying and brutal way, being subjected to a 3-day-long ordeal, in which his execution has to be one of the most harrowing in history. It was prolonged suffer in immense brutality. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.